Imagine a small jar. Inside is a translucent, greasy mass that we have been used to using for so long that we have almost stopped perceiving it as a distinct product. It lies somewhere in the bathroom. It is smeared on lips, dry skin, and chapped areas, sometimes used as a lubricant, and sometimes kept in a medicine cabinet just to have it on hand. And if you ask a person what Vaseline is made of, the majority will most likely answer something like, from fat, from some cosmetic oil, from wax, or even, I have no idea. What's the difference? And the difference, actually, is very interesting, because Vaseline is a petroleum refining product. Not in the sense that they just poured gasoline into it and thickened it with starch. No, the story is much more interesting. What today lies in a neat little jar and is sold as a skin protectant began as a very unpleasant-looking substance that hindered workers from extracting oil. It clung to the equipment, clogged the mechanisms, accumulated where no one particularly wanted to see it. And the oilmen called it roughly what a useless byproduct should be called: rod wax. A waxy petroleum residue. But the workers noticed one oddity. This sticky muck, which interfered with drilling, somehow helped quite well with minor skin injuries. And this is where the young chemist Robert Augustus Chesbrough appears. He was only 22 years old. And the year was 1859, the very year usually associated with the beginning of the industrial oil era in the U.S., when Edwin Drake's well started operating in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And exactly right next to this oil boom begins the story of a product that, a few decades later, would end up in almost every American home. But the most interesting thing is not even that. The most interesting thing is that Chesbrough wasn't trying to invent Vaseline. He had no idea he needed Vaseline. He was looking for an opportunity to make money on oil, but as a result, he became interested in what the oil workers just wanted to scrape off the equipment and throw away. And here the story of one small jar begins to turn into the story of the oil industry, chemistry, the mass market, medicine, wars, and, of course, one of the most successful brands in the history of consumer goods. And at the same time, we'll figure out why the word Vaseline has become almost a household name, why its name is connected to water, why Chesbrough himself initially didn't sell a cosmetic product at all, how he forced people to buy an unknown greasy substance, and why, a century and a half after its appearance, Vaseline still exists in almost its original form. But let's take it step by step. Let's start from that very place. Titusville, Pennsylvania, 1859. If today we imagine the oil industry as huge oil fields, pipelines, oil refineries, tankers, and some gigantic structures, then in the mid-19th century, all this was just beginning to form. Oil in North America was known long before the industrial era. It was used in various forms, and natural seeps of oil and bitumen were known even earlier. But one problem was the scale. How to turn strange puddles of black liquid into an industrial product. One of the key directions for using raw petroleum back then was the production of kerosene, which could be used in lighting lamps. And so, the young chemist Robert Augustus Chesbrough appears in this market. In 1859, he was 22 years old. He works with petroleum products and goes to Pennsylvania to see what can be done at all with the new raw material that is beginning to become a huge business. And he finds himself in a completely new world. Oil derricks, drilling rigs, workers, dirt, oil, and equipment that has to be constantly cleaned. It is here that Chesbrough pays attention to a strange waxy mass that formed on the drilling equipment. Historical sources call it rod wax. Moreover, there is an important detail here. This is not finished Vaseline, and not even some kind of natural jar of Vaseline. This is a raw petroleum material that had to be processed. Today we know that petrolatum, or petroleum jelly, is a purified mixture of semi-solid hydrocarbons obtained from petroleum. In the USP Pharmacopeal specification, white petrolatum is defined exactly as a purified mixture of semi-solid hydrocarbons of petroleum origin. So the answer to the question from the video's title is indeed quite prosaic. Vaseline was made from oil. But if we stop here, the story will be boring. Because another question is more interesting. Why did someone even decide to turn a petroleum residue into a skin remedy? Here begins the most interesting part. Workers in the oil fields had already noticed the properties of this mass. It was greasy. It covered the surface. And, judging by historical descriptions, workers used this material on small cuts and burns. This is a very important point, because later, a beautiful story would emerge that Chesbrough was a true genius and practically invented the medicine all by himself. But the initial idea did not arise in a laboratory. It arose from observing what the workers themselves were already doing. And here, the story is very similar to many other stories of the Industrial Revolution. First, someone notices a strange property of a material. Then, another person realizes that this property can be standardized. Then, a purification technology appears. Then, packaging. Then, a trademark. Then, advertising. And then, 100 years later, no one remembers that it all started with a sticky petroleum residue near an oil rig. Chesbrough became interested in exactly this. He took samples, returned to New York, and began experiments. Today we might call this ordinary research work, raw material to purification, to filtration, to property control, to obtaining a stable product. But back then, everything was much less obvious. It was necessary to understand what exactly the useful part of the material was. It was necessary to remove undesirable components. It was necessary to obtain a product that could be produced successfully, not just once in a laboratory, but repeated over and over again. And this is fundamental. The invention of a product is not necessarily the moment when a person first saw an interesting substance. Much more important is the moment when they figured out how to make it identical every single time. Later, Chesbrough received a patent for a method of processing crude petroleum. Here it is worth looking not at later advertising tales, but at the patent itself. U.S. Patent Number 127,568, issued to Robert Chesbrough on June 4, 1872, is titled Improvement in Products from Petroleum. That is, improvement in products from oil. And in this patent, Chesbrough explicitly writes that he named the product he invented Vaseline. He describes it as a thick, oily paste-like substance, semi-solid under ordinary conditions, and capable of becoming liquid when heated. But the technology is especially interesting. The raw material was petroleum residue. Then it was purified. The patent describes the filtration of the petroleum residue through bone char, as well as the use of vacuum distillation, as a method of obtaining higher quality raw materials for subsequent purification. Today the formulation looks almost mundane. Petroleum to fractionation, to residue, to purification, to filtration, to finished petrolatum. But imagine how vastly the appearance of the source material must have differed from what we consider Vaseline today. An oil field, a black, dirty, waxy mass, and through several stages of purification, an almost white or translucent substance without a characteristic petroleum odor. Now this is much more interesting, because the chemical industry in general very often works exactly like this. The raw material itself can look absolutely unattractive, and the value appears after someone has learned how to properly separate and purify it. Glass is made from sand. Thousands of different substances are made from oil. Cellophane is made from wood. Vaseline is made from a strange petroleum residue. And the better the industry learned to purify the source material, the further the final product could move away from its origin. so far that 100 years later, a person smearing Vaseline on their lips is unlikely to think of oil. And this is perhaps one of the main tricks of the modern chemical industry, to turn something that looks dirty and scary into a completely neutral household item. And here another interesting question arises. If the product is derived from petroleum, why wasn't it just called petroleum jelly? In fact, such a name also exists. Petroleum jelly is the common name of the product. Petrolatum is the chemical pharmaceutical name, and Vaseline is a trademark. And this is a very important distinction, because today people often say, buy some Vaseline. Although from the perspective of market language, Vaseline is a brand, and petroleum jelly is a product category. Just like the story with many other brands that gradually start being used as the names for an entire product category. So why did the word Vaseline appear? The most common explanation provided by the company itself is connected to the German word Wasser, water, and the Greek eleon, oil. That is, the idea of the name roughly combines water and oil. But here too, one should be careful. Do not turn this etymology into an absolutely indisputable scientific fact. Historical trademark materials confirm that the word Vaseline was registered by Chesbrough's company in the US in 1878 as a trademark for a petroleum preparation. And this is already a definitively verifiable part of the history. So by the early 1870s, not just a product appears, a name appears. And a name is already the beginning of a brand. Here the story gets even more interesting. In his patent, Chesbrough lists many potential uses of the product. He speaks of its use in treating leather, as a lubricant for various mechanisms, for hair, for the care of chapped hands. That is, initially, we are not dealing with a specialized cosmetic product at all. This is a universal petroleum material. Today we call such things multifunctional. And in the 19th century, this was especially important, because the mass consumer goods market was just forming. There was no such huge assortment of specialized products as there is today. If you had a material that could be used in several areas at once, it was a huge advantage. In the patent, Chesbrough explicitly writes that Vaseline is suitable for treating leather, lubricating machines, use on hair, and caring for chapped hands. Pay attention to the logic. He doesn't say, here is a cure for everything. He essentially says, here is a material with certain physical properties and it has many applications. But then the history of marketing begins. Let's imagine a situation. You come to a pharmacy in 1870. They offer you a small container with a translucent, greasy substance. They say, this is from oil. What will you answer? Most likely, no thanks, I don't need anything. Because for a buyer, the origin of a product can be more important than its properties, especially if the product is new. And here Chesbrough had to solve one of the most difficult tasks of an entrepreneur. Not to obtain a product, but to convince people that they need it. Today, a company can run ads on the internet, buy search advertising, pay bloggers, show a video to millions of people. In the 19th century, none of this exists. There are newspapers, there are shops, there are lectures, there are demonstrations, there are samples, and Chesbrough uses a very old-fashioned but extremely effective strategy. He lets people try the product. The company and historical materials describe a sample distribution campaign where Chesbrough personally drove around New York handing out small portions of the product to people. Other historical studies dedicated to the packaging and trade of Vaseline also describe such giveaway campaigns and link them to the formation of demand through apothecaries. And the logic here is ironclad. You don't need to convince a person with words. Give them the product. The person will try it. Then tell their neighbor. The neighbor will ask the apothecary. The apothecary will order the goods. And so a grassroots demand appears. Essentially, this is a very early version of what today would be called a sampling campaign. Samples. Only instead of a promoter in a shopping mall, a man on a horse-drawn wagon. There is a beautiful detail to this story. Chesbrough didn't just hand out samples, he built a chain. Sample, to person, to local apothecary, to order, to regular customer. And this is already very much like modern marketing. The product does not sell itself. It must get into the hands of a person. After that, the person must get a good enough result to tell someone else about it. In the conditions of the 19th century, word of mouth was not just a supplement to advertising. It could be the primary information distribution system. And Vaseline was very well suited for such a model. Why? Because the product is simple. It does not require special instructions. It can be applied on dry skin, on chapped lips, in the household, for some technical tasks. In Chesbrough's patent, the list of applications is generally very wide, and this means that the probability of the sample turning out to be useless is relatively low. Roughly speaking, you were given a jar of an unknown substance. You didn't like it on your face? Another way to use it will be found. Need a lubricant? Here you go. Dry hands? Here you go. Skin chapped? That too. And this helped the product find its place in everyday life. The Vaseline company indicates that by 1874, sales reached a pace of about 1 jar per minute in the US, that is, over 1,400 units a day. How accurately should this figure be perceived? As a corporate historical brand figure, and not as a modern sales audit. But even if we look at it exactly that way, the scale is impressive. Because we are talking about a product that just a few years ago was a petroleum residue near an oil rig, and now it's sold in packaging. It's given a trademark. It is advertised. It appears in pharmacies. People start to perceive it as a household item. And this is the first big turning point in history. Oil stops being just fuel. It becomes a source of consumer materials. This is a very important context of the 19th century, because the Industrial Revolution is gradually changing not only production, it is changing the very structure of everyday life. Cheap industrial materials appear. Mass packaging appears. Standardized chemistry appears. And things that could previously only be obtained from natural substances or made by hand begin to be produced by the thousands and millions of units. Vaseline fits perfectly into this new system. Here it is important to pause. Because historical advertising materials of the 19th and 20th centuries often presented Vaseline almost as a universal cure. But modern medicine views petroleum jelly much more prosaically, and that is precisely why, perhaps, it is much more interesting. It is not a magical medicine. It does not fix the skin directly. The main effect is occlusion. That is, the material creates a relatively continuous water-repellent layer on the surface of the skin. This layer reduces water loss from the skin's surface. That is precisely why petrolatum is used as a skin protectant. The U.S. National Library of Medicine defines petrolatum as a system of semi-solid hydrocarbons obtained from petroleum, which is used as an ointment base, a skin protectant, and a lubricant. The FDA also includes petrolatum and white petrolatum in its list of active ingredients for skin protectants. And the official drug labels for products based on 100% white petrolatum indicate its purpose as a skin protectant, a means for temporary protection of minor cuts, scrapes, and burns, as well as for protecting chapped skin and lips. So everything is much less magical, and at the same time, much more brilliant. Because sometimes the best way to help the skin is not to treat it with something active, but simply to prevent it from losing water too quickly. And this is another important historical correction. Early marketing could attribute an extremely wide range of healing properties to Vaseline, but modern data and regulatory documents are much more cautious. For example, current instructions for plain petrolatum indicate: do not use it on deep puncture wounds, Do not use it on animal bites. Do not use it for serious burns, and consult a doctor if the condition worsens or persists. This is a good example of how society's attitude toward the same product changes. In the 19th century, we have a universal healing ointment. In the 20th century, this is a remedy for dozens of problems. In modern pharmacology, this is a protective occlusive agent with quite specific properties and limitations. And this does not make the product worse at all. On the contrary, it shows how well one simple physical characteristic of a material matched human needs. Now, without the marketing, why does the skin become softer from it in the first place? Because the top layer of our skin is constantly losing water. Healthy skin has its own system of barriers that reduce this loss. If the barrier is broken or the skin is very dry, water evaporates faster, and Vaseline creates a hydrophobic layer on top. Water passes through it poorly. Therefore, more moisture remains in the skin. That is precisely why petroleum jelly is considered an effective occlusive agent. The Vaseline company describes its petroleum jelly exactly as an occlusive, that is, a substance that locks in moisture. And in medical practice, petrolatum is used as an ointment base and a skin protectant. And pay attention to one curious thing. It seems to us that for a complex result, a complex substance is absolutely necessary. But sometimes, no. Sometimes molecular chemistry is very simple. Apply a hydrophobic layer leads to reduce water loss, leads to the skin gets the conditions to repair itself. That's it. No witchcraft. And then arises not a chemical, but a business question. What to do with success? Because one product is good, but if you have found a material with a very wide range of applications, it is logical to try to make more products based on it. And this is exactly how the brand gradually begins to develop. The historical items of the Smithsonian show how wide a range of products under the Vaseline brand existed in the first half of the 20th century. The museum collection has, for example, various forms of Vaseline in medical and household kits. Historical sources describe product variants, including perfumed, camphorated, and carbonated versions. And here we see a very modern logic. There is a basic raw material. There is trust in the brand. There is one universal product, and then you can build an entire product line around it. But the brand must do one more thing. It must become recognizable. In 1878, the word Vaseline receives registration as a trademark in the US. And here, a very important process begins. Before this, petroleum jelly was a material. After this, Vaseline is a name. These are two completely different things. The chemical composition can be replicated. A name is already more difficult. People begin to look for exactly it. A reputation emerges. Recognizable packaging appears. A visual image appears. And the brand gradually detaches from the original inventor. A person may no longer know Chesbrough's surname, not know where Titusville is, not know what rod wax is, not know that the raw material goes through petroleum refining, but they know Vaseline. And this is the true achievement of mass branding. The most beautiful part of this story is not about the skin at all. We are used to thinking of Vaseline as a cosmetic product, but historically, its possibilities are much broader. Even in the 1872 patent, Chesbrough lists uses as a lubricant, in skin and hair care, and also on mechanisms. And this is not surprising, because the properties of petrolatum are very versatile. It is chemically relatively inert, does not dissolve in water, possesses lubricating properties, coats the surface, and creates a hydrophobic barrier. The USP describes petrolatum as a semi-solid mixture of hydrocarbons of petroleum origin and notes its characteristic properties, including practically complete insolubility in water. That is precisely why the same substance can be found in completely different fields. skin, pharmacy, cosmetics, engineering, manufacturing, and even the space industry. For example, in NASA's archival documents, petroleum jelly is explicitly mentioned as a technological material for mold lubrication when manufacturing plaster products. And here, the story unexpectedly returns to what Chesbrough wrote in his patent back in 1872. He didn't see a medicine, he saw a universal material. A common confusion needs to be clarified. The story is often told as follows. Workers discovered that petroleum residue helps wounds. Chesbrough saw it and invented Vaseline. But this is a slightly simplified version, because Chesbrough did a much more complex thing. He didn't just take the material from the oil rig. He developed a method for its purification and the production of a stable product. This is a fundamental difference. A worker might accidentally find a use for a raw material. A chemist must turn it into a reproducible product. If today one batch is white, tomorrow black, the day after tomorrow liquid, and a week later it smells like gasoline, you do not have an industrial commodity. You need standardization. And the industry of the 19th century was exactly occupied with turning artisanal and random processes into standardized ones. Therefore, the true hero of the story is not only the substance itself, it is also the purification process. And here we can make a brief stop. You can take any beautiful cosmetic bottle, put it in an expensive store, write intensive repair, draw some minimalist label, and a person will never guess where this product ancestor even came from, because there is a huge technological distance between the original crude oil and the final little jar. But the very nature of the product has not gone anywhere because of this. The USP still defines white petrolatum as a purified mixture of semi-solid hydrocarbons obtained from petroleum. That is, if we're being completely honest, yes, Vaseline is oil, only purified, processed, standardized, and transformed into a material with specific physico-chemical properties. It's roughly like saying, glass is sand. Formally, yes, but if you take a handful of sand, you won't get a window. And exactly in the same way, if you take crude oil, you won't get Vaseline. Between the source raw material and the final product lies all of industrial chemistry. And now imagine that you have to sell oil in a jar. This is already a marketing task. And Chesbrough understood it. The product has a strange origin, meaning the association with dirt needs to be removed. Cleanliness is needed. Packaging is needed. Repeatability is needed. Trust is needed. And here it helps a lot that Vaseline could be shown as an external product. People didn't see oil. They saw a transparent or white jelly-like mass. And this is a completely different psychological sensation. In this sense, the history of Vaseline is another example of how industry doesn't just create substances. It changes the perception of the substance. We take the raw material from the world of oil rigs. We run it through a technological process. We put it in a small jar. We stick on a beautiful label. And a few years later, the product no longer has any connection to an oil well for the consumer. Here it is important not to hide the petroleum origin. Petroleum jelly, petrolatum. The word petroleum is present in the name itself. So the chemical industry in general doesn't particularly hide the origin. It's just that most people don't translate the technical term in their heads. Petroleum, oil. And a funny situation arises. On the jar is written a word that essentially tells you, this is a petroleum product. But a person still perceives it as cosmetic. And perhaps, this is the best proof of how far the product has moved away from its original image. By the beginning of the 20th century, Vaseline was already becoming a well-known household product. And then an event occurs that helps finally cement it in the mass consciousness. The First World War. The Vaseline company indicates that during the First World War, petroleum jelly was in demand by American servicemen in Europe for skin care and chafing, and soldiers asked their families to send it from home. This is completely logical. Trenches, cold, moisture, dirt, prolonged walking, chafing, skin damage. And here a simple occlusive agent, which fits in a small container and does not require complex application, turns out to be very useful. Historical material from the National Museum of American History also shows the presence of Vaseline in medical kits and the household medical context in the first half of the 20th century. And here the brand receives what marketers today would call an incredible boost in trust. It becomes not just a cosmetic, it becomes part of daily survival. And then Vaseline is found around completely different things. This is why such a product lives so long, because it cannot be very easily limited to a single function. If it were only a remedy for dry lips, the market could have replaced it with something new. If it had been solely a medicine, it would have been ousted by more specialized drugs. If it were only an industrial lubricant, many specialized formulas would have emerged. But petroleum jelly exists simultaneously in multiple categories. In medicine, in cosmetics, in household care, in industry, in technical operations. And this makes it an extraordinarily resilient product. The National Library of Medicine explicitly lists the roles of petrolatum as an ointment base, topical protectant, and lubricant. And Chesbrough's patent, more than 100 years prior, actually spoke of the exact same set of properties. So the basic idea hasn't really changed. The history of Vaseline shows how important the connection of two industries turned out to be: oil extraction plus chemical processing. The oil boom provides the raw material. The chemist turns the material into a usable product. The entrepreneur turns the material into a product. The marketer turns the product into a brand. And mass retail turns the brand into a household standard. And this is already much more than the history of an invention. This is the history of an industrial ecosystem. And then the usual story for big companies begins. The inventor gradually fades from everyday memory. The brand remains. This happens over and over again. A person knows Scotch, but doesn't know Richard Drew. Knows Post-it, but rarely knows Spencer Silver. Knows Vaseline, but far from everyone knows Robert Chesbrough. And this is normal. Because the mass market works not with the biography of the inventor, it works with the name of the product. Chesbrough invented the technology and created the company. But in the mass consciousness, the word won. Vaseline. And the company grows along with the product. The history of the Chesbrough Manufacturing Company also gradually ceases to be the story of one man. The company expands. Industrial production appears. New facilities appear. And this is a logical stage. Because after a product becomes mainstream in one country, the next question arises: why limit yourself to one country? If the technology is relatively simple, if the raw material is available, if the brand is recognizable, if the product is easy to transport, then you can go further. Thus, a local petroleum substance gradually turns into an international brand. And this is almost a classic story of an American mass consumer product. A brand enters every home not just because of advertising. It is very important not to reduce everything to advertising. Advertising helps. But a long-living product must have another chain working. The product fulfills its promise, leads to a person trusts it, leads to buys it again, leads to recommends it to others, leads to the product becomes a habit. If you buy a jar once and forget about it, no brand will come of it. But if the product regularly proves useful, a repeat purchase occurs. And a few decades later, it turns into a thing that you're just supposed to have. Vaseline ended up in exactly this category. In the 20th century, Vaseline truly becomes part of American household culture. The company notes in its historical timeline that by the 1880s, the product had evolved into a widely used household good, and later the brand was positioned as the handiest thing in the house. And this formula is very telling. Not the most innovative substance, not the most scientific cosmetic, but the handiest thing in the house. This is the ideal position for a universal product, because it does not limit the application. It says, you will decide for yourself why you might need this. When there is a material with physical properties useful in a huge number of tasks, engineers begin to find applications for it. Lubricant, release agent, surface protection, hydrophobic coating, ointment base. And this brings us back again to the 1872 patent. Even back then, Chesbrough listed the technical applications of the material, including the lubrication of mechanisms. So there is no modern viral life hack here. The physical properties of the material truly allow it to be used as a lubricating and protective compound. And this can be seen even in technological processes. For example, in NASA's technical documentation, petroleum jelly is explicitly used as a release material in the manufacture of molds. And this, in my opinion, is much more interesting than any story about 100 ways to use Vaseline, because we see the exact same principle that was working back in the 19th century. Vaseline doesn't have to be a skin product, it is a material. And only then does a person decide, and where can this material be used? This is a completely different philosophy, and it explains why the product has not disappeared for so long. During the Second World War, petroleum jelly was also used in a military context. However, here it is especially important not to repeat numerous internet legends without verification. For example, there are widespread stories about special varieties of petroleum jelly for rescue kits and military use, but not every such story is equally well documented. Therefore, it is better to stick to what is confirmed. Official and historical materials show that petroleum and Vaseline compounds were present in the practice of military skincare and combating skin damage. And even this is enough. Because a product that appeared as a byproduct of the oil industry gradually turns out to be part of a completely different system, military medicine and supply. And here there is an interesting paradox. Most cosmetic products constantly have to prove we are better, faster, more natural, more modern, with active components, with a new formula, with a new technology, with a new scent. Vaseline hardly needs any of this. Its key promise is very simple. It is petroleum jelly. It does what it is supposed to do. And that is exactly why it is extremely difficult to kill it with marketing. You can create 10 new skin remedies, but if a person simply wants to apply a hydrophobic protective layer to the skin, basic petrolatum will still remain competitive. And this is already an interesting engineering principle. Sometimes the best design is not to add functions, but to remove everything unnecessary. Vaseline requires almost no explanation. Here is the jar. Here is the substance. Apply it to the surface. That's it. There is no complex dosage. There is no electronic device. There is no battery. There is no app. And of course, from a medical point of view, it has limitations. But within the scope of suitable applications, its simplicity turns out to be a massive advantage. And here we come to the main joke of history. You can take any beautiful cosmetic bottle, put it in an expensive store, write intensive repair, draw some minimalist label, and a person will never guess where this product ancestor even came from. Because there is a huge technological distance between the original crude oil and the final little jar. But the very nature of the product has not gone anywhere because of this. The USP still defines white petrolatum as a purified mixture of semi-solid hydrocarbons of petroleum origin. That is, if we're being completely honest, yes, Vaseline is oil. Only purified, processed, standardized, and transformed into a material with specific physicochemical properties. It's roughly like saying, glass is sand. Formally, yes. But if you take a handful of sand, you won't get a window. And exactly in the same way, if you take crude oil, you won't get Vaseline. Between the source raw material and the final product lies all of industrial chemistry. If you look at the company's history, everything here also develops according to a classic scenario. The founder creates a product. The company scales up. A brand appears. Then the company merges with another. And at some point, it becomes part of an even larger corporation. The company built around petroleum products and Vaseline gradually grows and changes its structure. In 1955, Chesbrough Manufacturing merges with Pond's, and Chesbrough Pond's is formed. And in 1986, Unilever announces a bid for Chesbrough Pond's. By the end of 1986, the deal becomes unconditional, and in February 1987, Unilever brings its stake to 100%. And here happens what has happened to other iconic 19th century brands. The founder died long ago. The company has ceased to be the founder's company, but the brand continues to live. And in this, there is a paradox. A person can invent a product, but if the product is truly good, sooner or later its history ceases to be their personal history. It becomes the history of the product. Chesbrough is long gone. Chesbrough Manufacturing as an independent historical company is also long gone. But Vaseline exists. And this is, perhaps, one of the strongest forms of an invention's existence, when it no longer needs the inventor. It is interesting that the core principle has hardly changed. The modern USP still defines white petrolatum as a purified mixture of semi-solid hydrocarbons of petroleum origin. The Vaseline company says that its original petroleum jelly remains based on the same category of material and undergoes a multi-stage purification. That is, over more than 150 years, we have changed the packaging, the logo, the marketing, the sales channels, the corporate structure, and the product line. But the basic idea did not have to be reinvented. This is very telling, because if a technological principle is so successful, it doesn't need to be improved just for the sake of improving. Can Vaseline be considered eco-friendly? No. And here, too, it is important not to fall into the opposite extreme. We can respect the engineering simplicity of the product and, at the same time, remember its origin. Petrolatum is a petroleum product. Oil is a fossil raw material. Therefore, statements like Vaseline is completely natural and eco-friendly will be misleading. It truly differs from many synthetic cosmetic ingredients in that it chemically represents a mixture of hydrocarbons of petroleum origin and not a complex synthetic polymer. But this does not automatically turn it into an environmentally flawless material. That is precisely why, in a good historical scenario, it is better not to say, oil is bad, natural is good, because the history of the chemical industry is much more complex. Oil has become the basis for a huge number of useful technologies. But its environmental consequences are a separate and major topic. However, there is one unexpected thing. The more we study Vaseline, the less it looks like a cosmetic product. It starts to look like one of the fundamental household materials of the industrial era. Because it can be viewed not as a product for the lips, but as a technological function to protect a surface. And this is already much more universal. Skin? Yes. Metal? In certain technical tasks, yes. A mold during manufacturing? Yes, as a release agent in the respective processes. For example, this is directly reflected in NASA's technical documentation. An ointment base? Yes. A lubricant? Yes, this is explicitly present even in Chesbrough's original patent. And all this makes Vaseline a very unusual product. Why hasn't it disappeared like dozens of other substances? Because the product hit a rare technological sweet spot. It is cheap, stable, easy to store, easy to use, long-lasting, performs its function well, and the technology derived from it does not require complex infrastructure from the end user. So we have before us a classic industrial workhorse. Not a supercar, not a spaceship, but a workhorse. A product that simply does its job. Humans always underestimate workhorses. Because attention goes to loud inventions, the most powerful engine, the fastest plane, the most expensive computer, the newest smartphone. But a material that lies in a jar and prevents water loss through the skin? Not very spectacular. But precisely such materials often turn out to be more durable, because they are built into everyday life. You don't notice them, and that means they have already won. And at this point, it becomes clear why Vaseline is so deeply surprising. We are used to perceiving the history of technology as the history of complex machines. But sometimes a technological revolution looks like a small jar with a transparent, greasy mass. And it starts not in the laboratory of a pharmaceutical giant, not in a sterile room, and not even in a medical institute. It begins near an oil well, with workers, with a drilling rig, and with the residue that hinders this rig from working. But could Vaseline stop the whole world? No, of course not. A title like Why the Whole World Would Stop Without It works as clickbait, but if taken literally as a historical statement, it would be an exaggeration. And here it is better to be honest. Vaseline is not the irreplaceable foundation of the entire human civilization, but it is a very illustrative example of how one cheap and simple petroleum material embedded itself simultaneously into a massive number of household, medical, and technical processes. And that is exactly why its story is so interesting. Because Vaseline is a story about how garbage becomes a commodity. And that is a completely different story. Chesbrough didn't see a beautiful product, not a pharmaceutical formula, not cosmetics. He saw a strange petroleum residue. And then he asked a question. What can be done with it? And after that, only a few years passed before a commodity named Vaseline appeared. Then a brand appeared, then an international business, then corporate mergers, then a global company, and the substance itself remained approximately where it was at the foundation of this story. On the surface, in a jar, on the skin, and here the story comes full circle. At the beginning, we talked about how Vaseline seems to be a completely ordinary product, and now we know why. It became ordinary precisely because its history was so successful. And this is, perhaps, one of the most interesting regularities in the history of technology. The more successful an invention is, the less people notice it, because it ceases to be an invention. It becomes part of the environment. You don't recall who invented the spoon every time you use it. You don't think about metallurgy when you open a door handle. You don't think about petrochemistry when you touch plastic packaging. You don't think about polymer chemistry when you use Scotch tape. And you don't think of a 19th century drilling rig when you apply Vaseline to chapped lips. This is exactly what it means. The product has won. It became so familiar that it stopped requiring explanations. But sometimes it is useful to ask this question. Not, what is this? But, where did this even come from? Because behind this little jar stands Pennsylvania. The oil boom. Workers on oil rigs. Robert Chesbrough. A chemical laboratory. Filtration. The 1872 patent. The 1878 trademark. A wagon with samples. Pharmacies. The mass market. World War I. Medicine. Industry. Corporate mergers. And a global brand. And the beginning of the whole story was almost comical. A man came to an oil region. He saw how workers were removing some strange mass from the equipment, and instead of, "Ew, what is that?" he said, "Interesting. Here actually is the entirety of progress. Sometimes it starts with this word. What makes Vaseline truly amazing? Not that it was made from oil. That is only the first layer. It is amazing because initially it was a byproduct and a problem for the oilmen. Because a chemical purification process was required to turn it into a stable material. Because Chesbrough understood the commercial potential of the product. Because he used samples and personal demonstrations to form a market. Because the brand was registered back in the 19th century. Because the material turned out to be useful in several completely different areas at once. And mainly, because more than 150 years later, the basic idea of the product is still working. So, the next time you see a jar of Vaseline, you will no longer see just a jar. You will see an oil well. And the residue on drilling equipment. A young chemist. A laboratory in New York. A patent. A wagon with samples. The first customers. The apothecary. The military. Engineers. And a massive consumer industry. And inside this jar will not be oil. There will be a much more interesting thing. A purified mixture of hydrocarbons obtained from petroleum, which a human learned to turn from a problem into a useful material. And, probably, this is exactly what the true story of Vaseline is. Not in the fact that it was made from oil, but in the fact that once upon a time, someone looked at a petroleum residue that the rest just wanted to clean off the equipment and saw a product in it.